Okay, feasts. Now away from the sacrifices, done all the sacrificing, and that's the hard part. Now let's look at the feasts. The feast of how do the Jewish people celebrate? Yes, they do. And do they celebrate today even? Do you realize that the one guy that was in prison they kidnapped basically a Jewish soldier who's been in prison for 5 years. He's set free today. And so the Jewish people today will be celebrating his release. It's a big deal in Israel even this day. So philosophy, basically seasons. Let me just describe seasons. In New England, do we get 4 seasons a year? Some people think really we only get summer and winter, But actually what you're seeing right now is fall. And to have some of you go up to New Hampshire in the fall and see the mountains covered with trees and the beauty of that. If you ever get a chance in the fall, I've been told that the wind is blowing the leaves off the tree, but particularly New Hampshire is absolutely gorgeous to see the trees. So we have fall, we have summer, we have fall, we have winter. Our winter is big in New England, and then we get spring, and spring is, the coming to life and things. So we get 4 seasons a year. Now I want you to conceive of, is anybody from California here? California? Yeah. The weather in Israel is more like, I'm told, I've never lived in California, but I'm told it's more like California, in that basically they get 2 seasons a year. For the summer, you get about 4 or 5 months of absolute dry. Every day is exactly the same. So when you go to the weather forecast, here's the weather forecast in the summer in Israel. The same. And it just goes on like that because every day you go out, it's sunny, it starts out cool in the morning, it gets hot in the day, and then what happens in the evening? It gets cool again, and it gets actually almost cold at night, okay? And then the next day starts cool in the morning, warm in the end, every day. No clouds, every day is sunny, 4 months absolutely dry. It's a summer season, okay? Then what happens? That's one of their seasons, okay? What happens then in the winter is that they get their rainy season. And so they have what's called the earlier rains and the later rains. The earlier rains will be like in September, October, November, the early rains, and then they'll get the later rains in the spring. And so they'll have the earlier and later rains. So they get the rainy season and the dry season. Does that affect things? That they only have 2 major seasons like that? And we'll see what that affects and stuff. So in the spring, they're going to basically get their wheat and barley harvest. Can wheat and barley make it through the summer? 4 months of no rain? No, they can't make it. So the wheat and barley, they come off the rainy season, and your grasses grow and things like that. And then basically you get this. If you ever go to Israel, try to go in the spring, if you have a choice. You go in the spring, and because the rainy season, you're coming off the rainy season, what will happen to the desert? You've got a desert that's all brown and looks like a desert, and then all of a sudden the rain will hit the desert, and what will happen? All the grasses will grow, and these little crocus flowers, you'll get these flowers. The desert will be covered with flowers, and it will be absolutely gorgeous. You'll see, the mountains covered with these flowers and green and all this kind of stuff. What's the problem? How long does that last? Okay, it lasts for a couple weeks, and then what happens? The dry, warm summer wind comes in, and what does it do to those grasses in a matter of days? Just turns them brown, and then all of a sudden the whole thing goes back to brown, and then you're brown for the rest of the whole summer. But for about 2 weeks in the spring, it's absolutely gorgeous. So April kind of times, it's beautiful to be over there. The desert blossoms like a rose, kind of, so to speak, and then all of a sudden, boom, everything just dies, withers and dies as summer comes. Now, so wheat and barley are grown in the spring. These feasts, we're going to go through 5 big feasts of Israel, and these feasts are feasts of harvest feasts. These are when, in other words, do you celebrate after you've harvested your crops? You celebrate after you've harvested the crops, and so in the spring will be the wheat and barley harvest. Now, Passover. What is the date for Passover? You guys all know this. In Christianity, we celebrate what at Passover time? Easter. Okay, that's our Easter when Christ died and rose again. That's when they celebrate Passover. So we're talking the spring. Passover is celebrated. What do? They've got a lamb, Passover lamb. They've got the bitter herbs, and what's the other thing? Unleavened bread. okay, crackers, unleavened bread. So those basically, those three things at Passover, for the Passover dinner, the Pesach dinner, and then they go 7 days eating unleavened bread. 7 days on eating unleavened bread, remembering that they had to go out of Egypt quickly, and they didn't have time for it to rise. That's Leviticus 23, tells about the Passover and unleavened bread. Now, that's in early spring. They start the harvest of the wheat or the barley in the early spring. Now, 7 sevens is what? Does anybody do math here? 7 squared, 49, plus 1 is 50. 7 sevens is the Feast of Weeks. Do you see why they call it the Feast of Weeks? It's 7 sevens. 7 sevens is 7 weeks, okay? A weeks of weeks. Can you see that that's weeks of weeks? 7 weeks. 7 times 7, the Feast of Weeks. 7 sevens. And 1 day added to that makes it 50. Pentecost, when I say penta, what's penta? Penta is 5, like Pentagon. And so Pentecost is how many days after the Feast of Passover? 50 days later. Okay, so you have Passover, and then you do 7 sevens plus 1. Passover, 7 sevens, 7 weeks. 7 weeks of weeks. 7 sevens, and you end up plus 1, you get 50, and that becomes Pentecost. Penta 5 cost. What happens by the way, what happened to Passover in the New Testament? In the New Testament, what happens? Jesus dies, right? Okay, you've got the Lord's Supper, and then all that stuff. Jesus goes in, is crucified, 3 days later rises from the dead. What happens at the Feast of Pentecost in the New Testament? Acts chapter 2, the Spirit comes down. Okay? And by the way, do we even have churches that are named after this? You have what used to be called the Pentecostal movement. Okay? Pentecostal churches. Anybody done Pentecostal churches? Yeah, there's Pentecostal churches. This is what it comes. By the way, what's a special passage for them? Acts chapter 2, with the Spirit coming down, the speaking in tongues, and that kind of thing. And so the Pentecostal church is based on this in Acts chapter 2. Now, so this is Passover and the Feast of Weeks. This will be early, what do we say, April, and this one will be 50 days later. We're into June then, usually something like in June. And then the harvest comes to an end. The wheat and barley harvest comes to an end. What is gleaning? When you go out to harvest the wheat and barley, they'll be in stalks, okay? Just like grasses with stalks, and they'll have the head on it, and the head will have wheat and barley in the head. You take a sickle, you know what a sickle, the communist sign for the sickle, and basically you grab a handful of these things and you chop it. Grab a handful, chop it, chop it, chop it. And so you do it by hand. Is it much better to do it with a John Deere tractor? Anyways, but they didn't have the John Deere tractor, so they're going to chop it by hand. Now, as they chop it by hand, is some of that grain going to fall on the ground? Now, a lot of it won't, but some of it will. Were they allowed to pick up the grain from the ground? No. They had to leave. If they chopped the grain, they chopped the stalks, and some of it fell on the ground. They had to leave it there because the poor followed the reapers. And the poor then, did the poor have to work and pick up the extra stuff that was left behind? Okay? They were also, when they pull out their John Deere tractors, and they do in their fields, they were to round the edges of the corners of their field. In other words, they were not to reap all the way into the corners. The corners of the fields were to be rounded. Who would harvest the rounded parts of the field? The poor. Okay? So do you see, was this Israel's way of helping to take care of the poor? By the way, did the poor have to get out and work for this stuff? It wasn't like they just got it handed to them. They had to get out there with the reapers and follow the reapers and work. Okay? They had to go to the corners of the fields, and they had to harvest those corners of the fields. And that's how they did it and stuff. And so this is called gleaning. When we get into the book of Ruth, we're going to see that Ruth is kind of like a gleaning machine, man. She's a worker. And she goes out and she gleans in the fields after the reapers. So this is in the spring. The spring harvests what? Wheat and barley. Those are your grasses kind of things growing up.